Today in Concrete Play, we're not going to be talking about gameplay, but we're going to be talking about writing. This is something I see people get wrong a lot, to the point where the last 3 indie games I played, all of them died solely because of bad writing. And the problem is that it's not that the writing was bad, it's that it wasn't game writing. So I'm going to show you just a little taste of how you might want to think about writing for your game if you've got a long game with a fair number of characters. So RPGs, tactical games, even puzzle games or first-person shooters if they're long enough. How do you write for a game? Well, the first thing that most indie devs, new indie devs think is they think of it as a plot arc. And they think of it with the same sort of intensity that they would think about a movie or a book. So they're like, well, we have to start with something that really draws in. You want to start as late as possible. That's the basic idea in 99% of media. You start late, you end early, and you cut out all the middle. And you just got to cram stuff in there. You don't want to waste any time. You stick to the plot arc. It's great writing. You can do that, but you can't do it for a game, at least not a long one, because a game, it doesn't act like a play or a movie or a novel. You have to stop thinking of a plot arc. Or rather, you can think of a plot arc, but if you think of the plot arc, you got to think of it like this. Here's the length of the game, and here's the plot arc. There. That's your plot arc. A good example of this is like Final Fantasy VI. In the end, Final Fantasy VI has a very, very memorable and powerful end villain, and it's very well remembered. But you have to remember that Kefka really wasn't a plot arc element. You didn't start off the game going, "We're gonna blow up the world," but instead, what happened is Kefka got introduced as a relatively minor bad guy. He was a very fun bad guy, but he was relatively minor. Complaining about getting sand on his boots. And then, he comes back once in a while, but it's never really a plot arc thing. It's just him developing his character. And then spoiler alert for those of you who haven't played this 20-year-old game, then he kills off the Emperor and destroys the world. And even then, the plot arc stops. And you don't come back to him until over here. So the game spends a huge amount of time not on book. They're wandering all over the planet, and the plot arc is not progressing. That's because you don't need a plot arc that constantly progresses. You don't need a plot arc that's always on everyone's mind. In fact, if you do have a plot arc that's always on everyone's mind, you're going to come off as looking silly because, you got this, we must stop these people from conquering the town. But first, let's go and do these 8 side quests, and I need to go back across the ocean and visit that island again because they have a sword and I can buy it now. And okay, if you're going to introduce a plot point where there is going to be a bad guy destroying a town, like right now, then you should also make it happen such that you have to go there right now. Otherwise, your plot loses all of its flavor. So instead of thinking of it as a plot arc, what should you think of it as? Well, if you're familiar with old stuff, you should think of it as wagon trains. But since most of you are probably quite young, you should think of it as an episodic TV show. So you've got your season of TV, and this is a good way to think of it because a season of a television show is roughly the same length as a game. 2 seasons is roughly the same length as a longer game, right? So what happens in these episodes? Well, maybe a bad guy shows up in this episode, and you mention him in a teaser in this episode, and here he shows up just for flavor, and then here's another major plot event with him, and then this is a breather episode, and then this episode starts off as nothing, but then he comes in at the very end, and then this is his big episode. It's sort of like that. You think of it in terms of episodes, and episodes are a very good way to think about RPG writing in particular, because RPGs are gated. Nearly every RPG features you slowly unlocking more places you can go. So when you're writing an RPG or a long adventure game or whatever, you should probably think more in terms of episodes and less in terms of plot, overarching plot. Now, you got to think about this. What sort of episodes? I mean, how are you going to make it episodes? Well, that's the reason this is a complicated idea for people to jump into because they're used to writing a plot arc. They're used to thinking of well, I want it to have punch. I want the players to get invested immediately. I want to have all this stuff. Got to keep moving. But you need to actually turn that on its head. What you need to do instead is you need to spend every episode developing the game a small amount. Now, what does that mean? Rather than developing the plot, you need to develop the other elements of the game. The other elements of the game are gameplay, place, and characters. If you can think of a 4, feel free to add it in. But for the most part, these are the 3 things I think of when I'm thinking of what my episodes need to be about. So when I am thinking of how am I going to lay this RPG out, I think of it in terms of episodes. In every episode, I simply focus on introducing one of these things while simultaneously reinforcing the others. A good example of this is Suikoden, where you slowly get introduced to the world map battle system, and not the world map. It's an army battle system, the big battles, and then of course you also get introduced to cooking contests and duels, and you've got all this stuff happening. And so in every episode, you just develop one of those gameplay elements, and you go to a new place and you talk about your characters some more. It's a very easy way to do it. That said, if you're having a hard time thinking of episodes, you can think back onto your overall goal. You want to have every episode maybe not move towards the end of the game, but at least build the end of the game. A good example of that is Final Fantasy VI's plot, where Kefka comes in early, and he keeps developing over the course of the game. So when he does become the evil villain, then you're like, oh, yeah, cool. Great. The other thing I wanted to teach you about writing is what I call woven characters, or the character weave, whatever you want to call it. This is an approach that will allow you to build your RPG to be memorable. A lot of RPGs exist, but most of them are forgotten in the depths of time. However, the reason that they tend to be forgotten is because they are forgettable. It's not that their gameplay is bad. There are lots of games, lots of RPGs with really interesting gameplay. There's an RPG I can't even remember the name of, but I still remember the gameplay because you had to build your guns out of a custom set of materials and stick them into a gun grid. It was kind of an interesting approach. And I also remember the world because it was a slightly steampunky, very memorable world, but I don't remember any of the characters or what the game's name was. Either way, if you want your game to be memorable, you've got to focus on the things that make it memorable. And most indie writers, are smart about making their worlds and their plots memorable. They have a cool idea for their world, they have a cool idea for their plot. Oh man, there's this floating city made out of crystal, and there are dragons that are going to lay siege to it. And yeah, that's cool. Great. That is good enough. People will remember that. But they won't remember your game unless they remember the people in your game. The characters are critical, and the normal way of introducing characters in an RPG... By the way, I was waving my hands around that whole time. I'm sure you could hear that, right? The normal way of introducing characters in an RPG is that when you introduce them, they have a plot. They have this big plot, a complicated plot where they're doing stuff and they're getting introduced and they're doing stuff, and then they join your party, and then immediately it all goes flat. And this is something that is shared by almost every forgettable RPG. Once the character joins your party, they are basically just a token and a bundle of stats, and you don't remember anything about them. Memorable RPGs. What are some memorable ones that you can remember? Well, right off the top of my head, I can think of Mass Effect and KOTOR and Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII and stuff like that. Those are very memorable. What do those games have in common? Well, let's use Final Fantasy VI as an example. If you haven't played it, shame on you, but this isn't a big spoiler, so you can continue to watch without worry. At some point in Final Fantasy VI, spoiler alert, you want a flying airship. Great. So how do you get your flying airship? Well, there's one available. It's owned by Setzer, who is a renowned gambler. So you have to gamble for the airship. How are you going to do that? Well, it turns out that Setzer is in love with an opera singer, and the opera singer is going to sing in an opera that night. So you've got to go in and handle that. Well, how are you going to deal with that? Turns out the opera singer looks just like one of your main characters named Celeste. Okay, obviously hugely contrived, right? I mean, come on, seriously? But that's okay. The contrived nature of it doesn't detract from the fact that it is a very fun, tongue-in-cheek little episode. And it is also designed in the perfect way because it weaves all of your characters together. And all of, not just your characters, it weaves everyone together. There's this new character that you've got to introduce. And most RPG writers would be like, okay, you need an airship. There's a guy named Setzer. He's in charge of the airship. You have to go up to him and, I don't know, you have to win gambling against him, whatever. That's the approach Suikoden takes. You have to, Suikoden 2, if you want the ship, you have to go and gamble with the pilots, the captains. And it's literally a gambling game. This is much, much more interesting, though, because it takes all the rest of the characters, and it weaves them together. First off, the reoccurring mini-boss, which is a octopus, he's back again. Except for, in this time, instead of being the guy who's tormenting you on the ocean or lakes or rivers, he's pulling a 2-ton weight along the rafters above the opera house and trying to drop it on the opera singer. So it makes no sense. It's very tongue-in-cheek, but it reintroduces the character. And this whole time, he's got things to say, and he's cussing people out, and he's making fun of you, and he's doing all that fun stuff. Great. That's fun. Down here, of course, you've got Celeste. She's being an opera singer. But not only is she talking about her opera experience and behaving in the opera, so you can judge for yourself what sort of person she is based on how she sings her songs and how she acts and reacts and how she resists getting involved and all that stuff. But even past that, you've also got Locke and a couple of your other crew, Sabin and all them. They're all involved in minor roles as well, and they are all talking about it and getting involved in small ways or big ways. Just as they see fit. And so all of these characters get woven together. And they're all put back into the game. You might have forgotten Locke, and you might have forgotten Sabin, and you might have forgotten Edgar, but now you're remembering them because they've been woven back together. Even the stupid octopus. And that's the basic idea of character weaving. Every time you have a plot event, an episode that introduces something, it's not just there to introduce the thing. In fact, that's the opposite. Once you've decided that you're going to introduce something, the point should be to make the player remember all of the characters better, to advance the characters, to make them interact and put them strongly in the head of the player. Discovering the airship, okay. Any way you could do that. You could just have them walk up and get an airship. You could have them buy an airship. You could have them gamble for an airship. But this absurd, contrived method of getting the airship in Final Fantasy VI is so memorable that for many people it's the scene they remember best from Final Fantasy VI. And this is a game where the world gets split apart on camera. So this is a very, very good way to think about your plot events. Every time you think of an episode, don't think of it as, I've got to introduce this thing. Think of it as, my characters are going to interact with this thing. I want all of the characters, both the ones in your team and the ones you've introduced before, and new ones, and villains, and good guys, and neutral people, all of them are going to interact with each other. And I want to make it memorable. So I've got to push these characters to do things that are very, very memorable, such as kidnapping an opera singer via airplane, or a war-torn general suffering PTSD singing opera tunes, or an octopus coming out of the water and climbing into the rafters. All of this stuff is very, very memorable because the team that built it wasn't afraid to pull the characters like Taffy. They knew that if they made the characters do memorable things, the characters would be memorable. So those are my writing tips. Don't worry about the overarching plot, and do worry about all of the characters. Even if your characters aren't terribly unique, as long as they are interacting, they will become unique and they will be remembered. Celeste is a remarkably uninteresting character. Terra is also a remarkably uninteresting character, but both of them have a strong place in many people's hearts because of the fact that they went through this entire game constantly interacting with things and having things happen to them and working on things and working through things. So, even though this wasn't about gameplay, I hope you found this interesting, and I really needed to bring it up because I have played four indie games this week, and all of them were bad because they didn't do this. All of them died after 2 or 3 hours because they couldn't keep my interest. The characters were washed out, never felt like anything. They were focused on the overarching plot, but they had to keep putting barriers in the way because otherwise the plot would be too short. It's just a bad approach. So please think about how you might write, and I recommend doing it as episodes and weaving the characters together.